The rebuilding of the Jewish temple may happen faster than anybody thinks, and this is the very thing that will make that happen. All right, folks, let's get into this. I have to tell you that some of you might not know all about the process that is involved in how I do these videos, and sometimes some of the things that I come across throughout that process will change the direction I go in what I present to you, because what I find sometimes can be so absolutely compelling that there's no other way to go. And so this is one of those situations. You see, what I was doing in the process of researching this topic and the discussion that ensues regarding the temple and what's happening in Jerusalem was I chose to read a few opinion sections of the Jerusalem Post, and I came across this. But what's remarkable about this particular opinion is that it is reflective of the sentiment that exists within a lot of people in Jerusalem. And if a lot of people feel this way, then that means we know one of the contributory variables that will exist and lead to the rebuilding of the Jewish temple. And we're seeing this happen. We're seeing the mindset begin to change by a lot of people. And specifically, the mindset is changing of the Jews regarding this particular subject. And this is really important to grasp and hold fast to, because what you're going to see and hear in this opinion being reflected is going to give you a better awareness of what will actually drive the rebuilding of the Jewish temple. And folks, this is an important one. I think that what this guy writes, his name is Mordechai Kaddis. This guy is he reflects very well the opinion of many people in Israel. And that opinion is growing. That feeling is growing. The nationalism that exists within their hearts. And when I say nationalism, it's not a bad word, okay? I am using this in context of a group of people who not only love the nation that the God of their fathers has given them, but in many cases, there's a lot of people who love the God of their fathers. And what they are seeking to do is go back to the place where their foundation was more stable, especially in light of so many of the crazy things that has happened in Israel. So reading this opinion is going to give us a lot of insight as into what is going to drive the rebuilding of the temple and what's going to allow it to happen. Now, this opinion was voiced in light of some discussion by the royal family in Saudi Arabia, who has expressed on numerous occasions the desire to take the place of Jordan on the Temple Mount and actually be responsible for the affairs of the Temple Mount. Now, by the way, I want to make myself very, very clear. This may be a true reality in the near future. This may be something that the people in Saudi Arabia may actually witness with their leaders, and it may be something that Jordan may at one point gladly yield or give up simply because of the problems that comes with having to watch over this specific area. And there's a lot of things geopolitically that are happening that are really important to be aware of and to understand. And this opinion really reflects the ultimate mindset that exists amongst many of the Jews in Israel, specifically living in Israel today, because it changes a lot. The game completely changes. And folks, I'm telling you, it's this mindset right here that we read about in this opinion that is driving the rebuilding of the temple. So let's start off with the title of this article. It says, "Don't let Saudis have any role on the Temple Mount. Put Israel in charge." Folks, that is the general sentiment of this opinion piece that I'm going to read to you. And I'm telling you right now, it's very eye-opening. And it clearly articulates the view of many people in Israel, and understandably so, especially in light of what happened on October the 7th, and particularly considering many of the things that they are going back to as a result of all of these things that have happened. Here's how it starts. It says, "The introduction of Saudi Arabia to the Temple Mount will only strengthen the feeling of Muslims that Jews have no connection to Jerusalem and the whole country." By the way, so many people in Israel are beginning to feel this way. And the last thing they want to do right now is accept or walk with something that will take away from the very deep connection that they feel to the land that their father gave them, to the land that their father's father gave them, to the land that God himself gave them. And I think this is an important thing. So we've got to really consider what's happening here and the opinion that drives this, the heart that drives this opinion, because it's going to make a lot more sense when you put it in its context. Look what the opinion says here. This is what the article says. Talks reportedly recently began in Israel about giving Saudi Arabia an official status on the Temple Mount, in addition to or as a replacement for Jordan, which has had a custodian status of the Temple Mount since 1994. By the way, that was the condition of the peace treaty that was solidified in 1994. And of course, it was, some people argue it was a very wise decision. Some people would argue that it gave a lot of a leeway into the Arab world that Israel will never be able to take back. Now, those of us that know Bible prophecy knows that that's not true. The question is, how is God going to actually do it when he sees for the temple to be rebuilt? But this gets really important because understand that there's a new type of discussion that's on the table right now, and that is a discussion for the normalization with Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia is looking for certain concessions in order to facilitate that normalization. And one of those concessions is going to be the guardianship of the Temple Mount area in Jerusalem. It's very, very important, and it's a critical detail that we cannot ignore here. So look what it goes on to say. The reason for these talks is to move toward normalization with Saudi Arabia. Granting such status will be considered part of a quid quo pro for the long-awaited peace. From a realistic view of the Muslim world today, Israel must reject outright any attempt by Saudi Arabia to obtain official status in Jerusalem for several reasons. And these are the reasons that he begins to list. And by the way, they're very smart reasons. They're well thought out, well articulated. Let's get into these reasons, okay? Here it is. Why Saudi Arabia must not have any official status in Jerusalem. First, Jerusalem has been the capital city of Israel for more than 3,000 years, and the place of the temple has been the heart of the Jewish people since the days of David and Solomon, 1,600 years before Islam even came into the world. And folks, that is a good point. He is right that in essence, if you even think about the inception of Islam, Islam really is, when push comes to shove and you really get down to the nitty gritty of it, as we've been talking about with Dr. J. Smith, Islam really is a Christian heresy. It started as a Christian heresy and then became the world religion that it actually is. But so interestingly enough, when you think about its origins, you realize how hard the devil has worked to bring deception into fruition, to cause people to not see who the true and living God is, to not recognize the ancient capital of God's ancestrally chosen people. And that is a very, very well received point. I think it's very good. Look what he goes on to write. He says, any renunciation of full Jewish sovereignty over the site of the temple is interpreted in the Muslim world as a Jewish renunciation of the very existence of the Jewish religion, something that undercuts the reason for the existence of the state of Israel. Would it occur to Muslims to give up full Muslim sovereignty over the Kaaba complex in Mecca? And that's a good point. They would never do it. Why would they never do it? They would never do it because the very identity that they're wrapped up in is in this sort of, dare I even say, fictitious site, okay? This is really important. By the way, the depth of realism that exists within the Temple Mount itself is far greater than any depth of realism that can be even thought of or associated with this area in Mecca. I think this is important. We've made this argument concerning Mecca, and Jay Smith and I have spent a lot of time talking about this. There's a lot of good reasons for believing this. But look at a second reason here. This is important. Second, Israel made many mistakes regarding the Temple Mount. The first mistake was when Moshe Dayan handed over the administration of the site to Jerusalem Waqf Islamic Religious Trust in 1967 with an understanding that they would not object to his illegal archaeological activities. Okay, it's so interesting when you think about this, right? The political games that were played, the things that happened in 1967. There's so much to say about this. And I can tell you right now, the person writing this commentary is simply scratching the surface. And I think that the person writing this commentary is doing that on purpose. The point is this: it should have never happened in 1967. And some people might listen to me saying that or read what this person is saying and saying that's a naive and shallow view of reality. But the reality of it is, if Jerusalem is the ancient capital of the Jewish people, and it is, and if it is the place that God has designated for them to worship, and it is, then what he is asserting here is absolutely correct. It was a huge mistake. But again, this was done for political power. This was done for lots of other reasons that I'm not going to get into. Just the analysis of that very issue alone in terms of what happened in 1967 is more than enough to make a 3-hour video. And I could sit down and talk about it on and on and on and on and get into some seriously in-depth analysis, which would take us all the way into 1995 when Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated, and why there's a connection with that and what happened in 1967 and all of the things that's happened in between. There's so much to talk about there. But nonetheless, he does bring up a very, very, very good point. And it's a very, very critical that we recognize this. Look what he goes on to say. He says the second mistake was giving the Jordanian kingdom its status on the Temple Mount in 1994 on the assumption that the Jordanian king would keep the PLO and Hamas away from the compound. By the way, if the Jordanian king did not want Hamas in his own country, if the Jordanian king did not want the Palestinian Liberation Organization in his country and literally just abolish them in a single day, what makes you think they're going to want to manage over the political affairs of the PLO under Yasser Arafat at the time? It doesn't make any kind of sense. But this was the line of thinking. And remember, Jordan wants nothing to do with the Islamic Brotherhood. So what this person is saying is absolutely right. And so it was undoubtedly a significant mistake, because the assertion that was made when all of this was yielded to, especially with Jordan in 1994, is that there would be almost an unspoken mandate upon Jordan to manage the affairs of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was becoming a more difficult situation for Israel as time went by. So this makes a lot of sense, what this person is saying. Here's the next reason that he gives. Third, the Temple Mount is a focus of subversive anti-Israeli activity by Turkey. A Saudi presence would cause conflicts between Turkey and Saudi Arabia and negatively affect Israel's relations with Turkey. Israel must remove any Turkish influence from the mountain. And he is right. Remember, there's a deep-rooted history with respect to all of this with the Ottoman Empire and what happened, especially the story of that Golden Dome right there. There's so much to say about Turkey's influence in the area of the Temple Mount. And when you start looking at somebody like Erdogan, who wants to get his hands involved in every little stinky thing that he can, this creates a real problem, a potential mega problem for Saudi Arabia, which translates into a nightmare for Israel, especially as it relates to Jerusalem being their sovereign capital and the ability for Israel to behave autonomously with the right to self-determination. This is something that's an impossibility. By the way, all of this is very well articulated by this person. He is arguing these points uniquely well, and this is the idea and the reflections of the nation of Israel in this current moment. The state of Israel really views these things as such. And this is important because where this comes to, where it ends, where it literally blossoms into the culmination, is going to be the building of the temple. That's what's going to end up happening, and the building of the temple will be the marker, the literal point of demarcation that will stop or put to an end a lot of the mindset that exists amongst Arabs concerning their right to this particular area and the lack of ability for the Jews to worship on that particular area. It deals with control. It deals with power. It deals with politics in a really ugly light. There's so much to say about this. And so this opinion is correct. The whole idea of the fact that the Temple Mount has become that, it really is. It's a focus of subversive anti-Israeli activity by Turkey. And that is very, very important. Turkey acts by proxy on the Temple Mount in ways you can't even begin to imagine. So even through NGOs, Turkey does this. And Israel, for that matter, almost has to let it happen because of the potential for international implications to actually go awry. There's so many complex situations here, and that's why this has been a hotbed of controversy with Ben Gvir and many of the things that have happened with the priests on the temple site. Folks, this is such a touchy issue. It's literally a powder keg. Let's go on to see what else he says here. Fourth, the Temple Mount is the focus of attention for extremist organizations such as Hezbollah al-Tahrir, which, by the way, very interesting. This phrase is a unique phrase in Arabic. When we say Hezbollah al-Tahrir, it means the party of freedom. That's what we say. Just like when we say Hezbollah means the party of Allah. That's when we say it in Arabic. It's a very interesting a word, and I have not heard reference to Hezbollah al-Tahrir in a long time, by the way. But it's interesting because this party has some very strong implications with its naming, especially in Egypt. Matter of fact, there's a street in Egypt that you may have heard of. We say Shawal al-Tahrir in Egypt, and this is where this big Islamic Brotherhood riot was started by the Clinton State Department. It had everything to do with what happened in Benghazi and the nonsense that happened as a result of the domino effect that took place. So this is a very serious terrorist organization, the Islamic Liberation Party, which, by the way, has some roots in many different parts of the Middle East, and believe it or not, even has some roots in Turkey. So this is important to point out. So he, let me read the beginning of his sentence again. He says, fourth, the Temple Mount is the focus of attention for extremist organizations such as Hezbollah al-Tahrir, Hamas, and the northern and southern factions of the Islamic movement, among others. What they all have in common is their burning hatred for the Saudi royal family, which, by the way, is very, very true. It's interesting, by the way, that the deep-rooted hatred that they have for the Saudi royal family. That's something that we don't really often talk about. And this is why the Saudi royal family always continues to maintain close ties with Israel for several reasons, but that happens to be one of them, right? But this is something that's uniquely important to point out because there is an understanding there of a dynamic that could potentially turn the Temple Mount into just an infuriating place for the rest of the world. Let me start off with that line where he says what they all have in common. Let me read that to you. It says, what they all have in common is their burning hatred for the Saudi royal family. Any clash between Saudi Arabia and these organizations could ignite the flames of conflict, and the blame would fall on Israel. And they are absolutely right. You could have somebody as just tyrannical as Hezbollah Tahrir just have one little clash with Saudi Arabia. I cannot imagine what would happen with Hamas, with the Islamic movement, with jihad. It would just be a powder keg on the Temple Mount. And guess what? Israel would be blamed. And in a way, they kind of would justifiably be blamed in that they allowed it to become a hotbed for all of these divisions, when in reality, Israel should be taking control sovereignly by itself. And that's something that it doesn't look like is going to happen in the near future, at least not a few months ago. Now it's looking like more and more that may happen, and it's becoming more and more of a reality. So let's look at his fifth reason. He says, fifth, it is possible that today there are understandings between the Israeli government and the Saudi crown prince, but there is no assurance that these understandings will survive the test of time. In the future, there may be changes in relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia that will lead to tensions between the two countries. So a Saudi presence on the Temple Mount will only worsen the situation. Now, this is one that I don't completely agree with, in that I believe Saudi Arabia wants to take control of the Temple Mount to minimize the significance of it. And if Saudi Arabia does take possession of the Temple Mount, it'll basically be what one of these big record companies do when they buy a smaller record company. They'll buy it and then they'll sell it off. And what I think Saudi Arabia will do if they maintain the position that the Jordanians currently have is they will slowly minimize the value in the Islamic world of that site, because they're understanding how deeply rooted the attacks are against Mecca right now, because of the scholarly works that are coming out that are pretty much destroying the existence of Mecca prior to, the 10th century AD. So there's a lot to talk about here, and there's some pretty important nuances to consider, but this is where I may disagree with him. Look at number 6. He says, sixth, if Saudi Arabia receives an official status on the Temple Mount, it could be blackmailed by Iran to allow Shiite activity in Jerusalem under its protection. Even if there is a clause in the agreement between Saudi Arabia and Israel that prohibits such a thing, Israel will not violate its peace agreement with Saudi Arabia, even if the Saudis are forced to violate this clause under Iranian pressure. And that is very, very true. What in essence he's saying is Saudi Arabia could become Iran's Trojan horse. And that's not something that you want, because Iran, through its manipulation of Saudi Arabia within a particular context as it relates to the security position that they hold on the Temple Mount, could be a launch pad for the type of destructive effort that Iran has demonstrated itself very capable of doing, and it's not something that you want to walk into. It's a very scary place. Look what he goes on to say. He says, lastly, Wahhabi Saudi Arabia may try to lower the centrality of Jerusalem in the contemporary Islamic discourse, since, according to Islamic sources, the original Al-Aqsa Mosque, the one mentioned in the Quran, is located in Saudi Arabia near the village of Wahara, around 30 kilometers northeast of Mecca, which, by the way, this is the point that I'm trying to talk about, right? This is the thing that I think that the Saudis are going to want to, in essence, sell off the value of of Jerusalem. Now, this person who's writing this opinion thinks that could backfire on Israel, because his opinion is that Saudi Arabia will seek to minimize the significance of Jerusalem altogether and basically sell it off in a way where nobody can have possession of it. And that is a viable potential thing that could happen. And look what he goes on to say. He says, any such attempt by the Saudis may arouse the wrath of all parties mentioned above, and the blame for bringing them into the sensitive equation will be placed squarely on Israel. And that's true. And he goes on to say, for all these reasons, Israel must not allow Saudi Arabia into the Temple Mount. In fact, the opposite is necessary. Israel must act to remove all the Islamic parties mentioned above from the Temple Mount complex and renew Jewish sovereignty over the most sacred place for Judaism for more than 3,000 years. Listen to that carefully, folks, and listen to what this person continues to say. This is so important. There is nothing preventing Muslims from continuing to pray on the Temple Mount, but the sovereignty and management must be in the hands of the state of Israel. Any other situation inspires hope in the hearts of Muslims that a day will come, and it is not that far away, that the Jews will run away, because if they give up their central place of worship, they really do not believe in their connection to Jerusalem and the land of Israel. Let me add to that, they also don't believe in the God that gave it to them, right? He goes on to say the introduction of Saudi Arabia to the Temple Mount will only strengthen the feeling of Muslims that Jews have no connection to Jerusalem and the whole country. This feeling is at the basis of the jihad against the existence of the state of Israel as the national, ancestral, and indigenous homeland of the Jewish people. Folks, this is so true. And I'm telling you, there is a rising sentiment amongst Jews that feel exactly this way. There is a movement amongst government officials. There is a movement amongst a growing population of people that say the Temple Mount must be taken back by Israel, that Israel must maintain its sovereign control over the Temple Mount. And folks, I'm telling you this right now, if that happens, and by the way, it's a lot more realistic than most people think. It is not going to be the crazy bloodbath that everybody says it's going to be. I'm telling you, the moment that Israel takes sovereign control of the Temple Mount will become the very moment that it opens itself up to the rebuilding of the temple that we've been talking about. And folks, I think it's happening sooner than later. Now, here's the good news. We know the end game. Right? The Bible tells us what to expect. We know exactly what should be happening, and we know what will be happening. And when we continue to look to the Lord to find the answers, we begin to find incredible things. We begin to witness amazing things happen, and we can say, to God be the glory, great things he has done, and watch what happens. Watch what God does. Watch the things that God will continue to do, that he promised he will do. And guess what, folks? As you study this stuff, as you're getting into the word, as you're learning the things that are being said, you get to be a part of this miraculous work. You get to be a part of the wonderful things that are happening in the current moment. And listen, I'll just simply say this. I have a lot of people that tell me, why are you yelling? Why are you so loud? Well, this is why right here, okay? I'm excited. That's my personality. It's the way I talk normally. But I'm excited because I see the writing on the wall. I see what God is doing. I see the amazing things that are happening right before us. And folks, I got news for you. Each and every single one of you get to be a part of it. Each and every single one of you are a kin. You are a part of all of this amazing stuff. Just keep your eyes on Jesus and watch amazing things happen. Why? Because he could come at any moment. And this stuff is getting real. And folks, when I say getting real, I mean getting very real. Things are changing, and they're changing rapidly. And God is good, and that will never change. And God is faithful, and that will never change. And God keeps his promises, and he'll never change. And we've got great things to look forward to. God bless you, and keep fighting the good fight.